The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Promise Creek, Colorado, in 1876. But it wasn't the sound that made everyone freeze, it was Harriet Mason's voice that followed, ringing out clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. "You're nothing but thieves, the lot of you." She shouted, her finger pointing accusingly at Mayor Wilkins and his circle of businessmen who had gathered on the steps of the town hall. The mayor's face flushed crimson as he adjusted his silk waistcoat. "Miss Mason, I suggest you hold your tongue before it gets you into more trouble than a woman like you can handle." Harriet stood her ground, her chestnut hair escaping from its pins as the wind picked up. At 22, she had the fire of youth and the wisdom earned from watching her father's newspaper business crumble under the mayor's corrupt influence. "I will not be silenced," she declared, her voice carrying across the town square where a crowd had begun to gather. "Everyone deserves to know that you've been stealing from the school fund to line your own pockets. My father had the proof, and now I do too." Mayor Wilkins descended the stairs slowly, his calm demeanor more threatening than if he'd been shouting. "Sheriff," he called, not taking his eyes off Harriet, "I believe Miss Mason here is disturbing the peace. Perhaps a night in jail would teach her some manners." The sheriff, a man whose badge had been purchased rather than earned, stepped forward with a nod. "Yes, sir." Harriet clutched the leather satchel containing her father's ledgers and notes tighter to her chest. "You can lock me up, but the truth will still be the truth come morning." "The truth," the mayor scoffed, leaning in close so only she could hear, "is whatever I say it is in Promise Creek." Then louder, for the benefit of the onlookers, "Miss Mason, you've been making wild accusations since your father's passing. We've tolerated your grief, but enough is enough." Someone in the crowd shouted, "She's crazy like her pa was." Another voice joined in, "Run her out of town." The mood shifted palpably as people who had once greeted Harriet warmly on her daily walks now looked at her with suspicion and hostility. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her as surely as the heavy Colorado sun. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice wavering slightly for the first time, "and neither was my father. He died trying to expose the truth." "Your father died because he was a drunk who fell into the creek," the mayor said coldly. "Now, are you coming quietly, or do we need to make this more difficult?" Before the sheriff could lay hands on her, Harriet made her decision. With one final glare at the mayor, she turned and ran, pushing through the crowd, ignoring the shouts and calls behind her. She heard the thunder of boots giving chase, but didn't look back as she darted down an alley between the general store and the saloon. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sprinted toward the edge of town, knowing that if they caught her, the truth would be buried along with her reputation. Promise Creek had been her home her entire life, but in the span of 5 minutes, it had become a place of danger. The sound of horses' hooves spurred her on as she reached the tree line at the edge of town. She plunged into the woods, grateful for her knowledge of the area from countless childhood explorations. The branches tore at her dress, and her lungs burned with exertion, but she pressed on, determined to put as much distance as possible between herself and the men who would silence her. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes of frantic running, Harriet paused, leaning against a massive pine tree to catch her breath. The forest had grown quiet around her, no sounds of pursuit evident. She allowed herself a moment of relief before reality set in. She was alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and her father's documents. She had no plan, no destination in mind. All she knew was that she couldn't return to Promise Creek, not yet. Not until she found someone who would listen, someone who would help her expose the corruption that had cost her father his life. As the adrenaline subsided, exhaustion took its place. Harriet slid down the trunk of the tree until she sat on the forest floor, clutching her satchel like a lifeline. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She needed to keep moving. The sheriff and his men might still be searching for her, and the forest, while providing immediate cover, wasn't safe as night approached. Wolves, bears, and mountain lions all called these woods home, and Harriet had no weapon to defend herself. Rising to her feet, she oriented herself using the setting sun and headed west. There was a trading post about 10 miles in that direction, if she remembered correctly from her father's maps. It wasn't much, but it was her best chance of finding help or at least shelter for the night. The journey was arduous. Her dress, designed for town life rather than wilderness trekking, caught on every bush and bramble. Her boots, though sturdy, weren't made for the rough terrain. By the time darkness fell completely, Harriet was exhausted, hungry, and hopelessly lost. The howl of a wolf in the distance sent a shiver down her spine. She needed to find shelter, and quickly. Spotting a small outcropping of rocks, she made her way toward it, hoping it might provide some protection for the night. As she approached, she noticed a faint glow firelight. Someone was camped there. Relief and wariness battled within her. The person could be a trapper, a prospector, or even an outlaw. But whoever it was, they had fire and possibly food, and Harriet was desperate enough to take the risk. She approached cautiously, trying to make out details in the flickering light. A man sat by the fire, his back to her, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his features. A horse was tethered nearby, and the smell of coffee and beans cooking made Harriet's stomach growl involuntarily. She must have made a sound because the man suddenly tensed, reaching for the rifle that lay beside him. "Who's there?" he called, his voice deep and steady. "Step into the light where I can see you." Harriet hesitated only a moment before stepping forward, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir. I'm lost and in need of help." The man stood, still keeping the rifle ready but not pointed directly at her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical garb of a cowboy: denim, leather, and dust. As she stepped closer to the fire, his expression changed from wariness to surprise. "A woman, out here alone." He set the rifle down but kept his hand near it. "That's a dangerous situation to find yourself in, miss." "Not as dangerous as the one I left behind," Harriet replied, her voice stronger than she felt. The cowboy studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, disheveled hair, and determined expression. Then, to her surprise, a slow smile spread across his face. "Well now," he said, tipping his hat back to reveal striking blue eyes that caught the firelight. "I've been waiting to hear that voice." Harriet blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon." "A voice with conviction," he clarified, gesturing for her to take a seat by the fire. "Too rare these days, especially from someone running scared through the woods." He poured coffee into a tin cup and offered it to her. "Name's Xavier Stone, and you look like you've got quite a story to tell." Harriet accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "Harriet Mason," she replied, hesitating before adding, "and yes, I suppose I do have a story." Xavier settled back down across from her, his gaze direct but not unkind. "Well, Miss Mason, I've got coffee, beans, and time. Why don't you start at the beginning?" In the dancing light of the campfire, Harriet found herself telling this stranger everything about her father's newspaper, his investigation into the mayor's corruption, his suspicious death that everyone called an accident, and finally, her confrontation in town that day. Xavier listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or furrowing his brow. When she finished, he poured her more coffee and added another log to the fire. "That's quite a burden you're carrying," he said finally, nodding toward the satchel she still clutched protectively. "Mind if I take a look at those documents?" Harriet hesitated. These papers were all she had left of her father and the proof she needed to clear his name, but something about Xavier's straightforward manner made her want to trust him. "Why would you help me?" she asked instead of answering. "You don't know me." Xavier's gaze met hers across the flames. "Let's just say I've seen what corruption can do to good people, and I've made it something of a personal mission to fight it where I can." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Besides, any woman brave enough to stand up to the entire town of Promise Creek is someone worth knowing." There was something in his voice, a hint of admiration perhaps, that made Harriet's cheeks flush with heat that had nothing to do with the fire. Slowly, she handed over the satchel. Xavier examined the ledgers and notes by firelight, his expression growing more serious with each page he turned. "Your father was thorough," he commented after some time. "This is damning evidence. No wonder they wanted to silence you." Relief washed over Harriet. "Then you believe me." "The numbers don't lie, Miss Mason." He handed the satchel back to her. "Question is, what do you plan to do now?" Harriet's shoulders slumped slightly. "I hadn't thought beyond escaping. I need to find someone with authority who isn't in Mayor Wilkins' pocket." Perhaps the federal marshal in Denver, Xavier nodded thoughtfully. That's a solid plan, but Denver's a good 4 days' ride from here, and they'll be looking for you on the main roads. He studied her for a moment. You need rest first. We'll figure out the next steps come morning. We. Harriet couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Xavier's smile returned, warming his features. Unless you'd prefer to continue alone. No, she admitted quickly. I would welcome your help, Mr. Stone, but I don't want to impose on your journey. Xavier, he corrected. And you're not imposing. Truth is, I was headed to Promise Creek on business, but I reckon that business just found me instead. He stood and retrieved a bedroll from his pack, which he offered to her. Get some sleep, Harriet. You're safe here. As she settled into the borrowed bedroll, exhaustion finally overtaking her, Harriet wondered about the cowboy who had so readily offered his assistance. There was more to Xavier Stone than met the eye, she was certain of that. But for now, she was grateful for his presence and the first sense of safety she'd felt since her father's death. Xavier took the first watch, his silhouette against the starry sky the last thing Harriet saw before sleep claimed her. Morning arrived with golden light filtering through the pine branches and the scent of fresh coffee. Harriet opened her eyes to find Xavier already awake, tending to the fire and preparing a simple breakfast of bacon and hardtack. Good morning, he greeted her, handing over a cup of coffee. Sleep well? Harriet nodded, surprised to realize she had indeed slept soundly despite the circumstances. Better than I expected, thank you. As they ate breakfast, Xavier outlined his plan. There's a small ranch about a day's ride from here, owned by a friend of mine. We can rest there and plan our next move. The owner, Hank Williams, is no friend to corrupt officials. He's had his own run-ins with them. You seem to know a lot about fighting corruption for a cowboy, Harriet observed, studying him over the rim of her coffee cup. Xavier's expression turned serious. I wasn't always a cowboy. Used to be a Pinkerton detective before I decided I preferred working on my own terms. He hesitated, then added, lost my brother to a corrupt judge who took bribes to look the other way when a mining company poisoned the water supply. 20 people died, including Gabriel, but no one was ever held accountable. I'm sorry, Harriet said softly, understanding now his willingness to help her. That's terrible. Xavier nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. It was 5 years ago. Since then, I've made it my business to help folks like you who are fighting against those who abuse their power. His smile returned, though more subdued than before. Now we should get moving. Can you ride? Yes, Harriet confirmed. My father taught me when I was young. Good. Xavier began packing up their camp. You'll have to ride double with me until we reach Hank's place. My horse, Thunder, is strong enough to carry us both for a day. The prospect of riding pressed against Xavier for hours sent an unexpected flutter through Harriet's stomach, but she nodded in agreement. Her practical side knew there was no alternative. Once everything was packed, Xavier helped her mount before swinging up behind her. His proximity was both comforting and discomfiting. His solid presence at her back a reminder that she was no longer alone in her fight, but also that she was placing an enormous amount of trust in a man she'd just met. They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, the rhythm of Thunder's gait lulling Harriet into a reflective mood. She thought about Promise Creek, about the life she'd left behind, and wondered if she would ever be able to return. Tell me about your father, Xavier said eventually, breaking the silence. Harriet smiled, the question warming her heart. Few people had asked about her father as a person rather than the crazy newspaperman he'd been labeled. Jonathan Mason was the most principled man I ever knew, she began. He started the Promise Creek Gazette with nothing but an old printing press and a determination to tell the truth, no matter how uncomfortable. He taught me everything I know about journalism, about standing up for what's right. She continued, sharing stories of her childhood helping in the newspaper office, learning to set type and edit copy, of her father's unwavering belief in the power of words to change the world. Xavier listened attentively, occasionally asking questions that showed genuine interest. He sounds like a remarkable man, Xavier commented when she finished. You're a lot like him, I imagine. I hope so, Harriet replied, surprised by how much the simple observation meant to her. By mid-afternoon, the landscape had changed from dense forest to rolling grasslands dotted with wildflowers. In the distance, Harriet could make out a small ranch nestled against a backdrop of mountains. "That's Hank's place," Xavier confirmed, following her gaze. "We should be there before sundown." As they approached, Harriet noted the well-maintained fences, the sturdy barn, and the modest but comfortable-looking ranch house. A plume of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting someone was home. A man emerged from the barn as they rode into the yard, rifle in hand, until he recognized Xavier. His weathered face broke into a wide grin as he lowered the weapon. "Xavier Stone, you old rascal, wasn't expecting to see you for another month at least." Xavier dismounted smoothly before helping Harriet down. "Change of plans, Hank. Hope you don't mind us dropping in unannounced." Hank's gaze shifted to Harriet, curiosity evident in his expression. "Not at all. Always room for friends and those they vouch for." He extended a hand to Harriet. "Hank Williams, miss. Welcome to Willow Creek Ranch." "Harriet Mason," she replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for your hospitality." "Let's get inside," Xavier suggested. "We've got quite a story to tell you, and I'd rather do it sitting down with some of your fine whiskey." Hank laughed. "Sounds serious." He led them toward the house, calling over his shoulder to a young ranch hand to take care of Thunder. Inside, the ranch house was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and a few homey touches that suggested a woman's influence, despite the bachelor lifestyle Hank apparently led. A photograph on the mantel of a lovely woman in outdated clothing offered a possible explanation. Once they were settled with drinks, whiskey for the men, tea for Harriet at her request, Xavier briefly explained their situation. Hank listened with growing concern. "Mayor Wilkins, you say?" He shook his head. "That name's been coming up in some unsavory conversations lately. There's talk he's in league with the Sutton gang, offering them safe harbor in exchange for a cut of their robberies." Xavier leaned forward, interest sharpening his features. "The Sutton gang, they're supposed to be in Wyoming territory." "They were," Hank confirmed. "Until about 3 months ago when they started hitting stagecoaches and trains in this area. No one's been able to catch them because they seem to vanish into thin air after each job." Harriet's mind raced, connecting dots. "That fits with what my father discovered." There were large deposits in accounts the mayor controls that didn't match any legitimate business. "Blood money," Xavier said grimly. "Using his position to protect outlaws and taking a share of the spoils." Hank whistled low. "That's a federal offense if you can prove it." "We have ledgers showing the deposits," Harriet explained, patting her satchel, "but no direct evidence linking them to the Sutton gang." Xavier was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We need more than just suspicious deposits to convince a federal marshal to act against an established mayor. We need to catch him in the act or find someone willing to testify." "That won't be easy," Hank warned. "Wilkins has been mayor for 15 years. He's got friends in high places." "Every man has enemies too," Xavier countered. "Someone who knows the truth and might be willing to talk for the right reasons." They discussed possibilities late into the evening, from potential allies in neighboring towns to various approaches they might take to gather more evidence. Eventually, Hank showed Harriet to a small but clean guest room, while Xavier would sleep in the bunkhouse with the ranch hands. Alone for the first time since her flight from Promise Creek, Harriet sat on the edge of the bed, emotions she'd been suppressing finally bubbling to the surface. Relief at finding allies, grief for her father, fear of what lay ahead, and an unexpected warmth whenever she thought of Xavier. It was overwhelming. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Xavier standing there, looking somewhat hesitant. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed," he explained. "Yes, thank you. Mr. Williams has been very kind." Xavier nodded, then seemed to struggle with something before speaking again. "Harriet, I want you to know that I meant what I said. We're going to see this through, all the way to justice for your father." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. "Why are you doing this, Xavier? Really? You could have pointed me toward Denver and continued on your way." He held her gaze steadily. "Because when I heard your voice in that forest, challenging the world despite everything being against you, I recognized something I thought was gone from this territory: courage. Real courage." His lips curved in a slight smile. "And because I think Jonathan Mason would have wanted someone to stand beside his daughter when she fights for the truth." Without thinking, Harriet reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." For a moment, they stood there, connected by that simple touch and a shared purpose. Then Xavier gently withdrew his hand, tipping his hat slightly. "Rest well, Harriet. Tomorrow we start planning in earnest." As he walked away, Harriet closed the door, pressing her back against it as her heart beat a rapid rhythm in her chest. She had come seeking justice for her father, not. Whatever this feeling was that Xavier Stone stirred within her, she shook her head, trying to clear it. There were more important matters at hand than the unexpected attraction she felt toward the former Pinkerton detective. She needed to focus on the evidence, on building their case against Mayor Wilkins, but as she prepared for bed, Harriet couldn't help but replay Xavier's words in her mind. "I've been waiting to hear that voice." Perhaps, she thought as sleep began to claim her, she had been waiting to find someone who would truly listen. The next morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. Over breakfast, Hank shared some news that gave their planning a new direction. "Word is there's going to be a big poker tournament at the Golden Nugget Saloon in Promise Creek next Saturday. High stakes, invitation only, but I happen to know several wealthy ranchers and businessmen from around the territory have received invitations." Xavier's interest was immediately piqued. "That's unusual for a small town like Promise Creek." "Exactly," Hank agreed. "And the Sutton gang has been quiet for 2 weeks now. Too quiet." Harriet leaned forward, following the line of thought. "You think the mayor is planning something?" "Using the tournament to gather wealthy marks in one place," Hank nodded. "It would be the perfect opportunity. All that money in one place, men who wouldn't normally visit a small town like Promise Creek. And if the Sutton gang robbed them, they'd be long gone before anyone could organize a proper pursuit," Xavier finished, "with the mayor ensuring any investigation led nowhere." "If we could catch them in the act," Harriet said slowly, "with evidence of the mayor's involvement." Xavier's expression was serious as he considered the risks. "It's dangerous. The Sutton gang doesn't leave witnesses and the mayor would recognize you immediately." "Not if I look different," Harriet countered. "Women can change their appearance more easily than men." "With the right clothes, a different hairstyle." "No," Xavier said firmly. "It's too risky. We'll find another way." Harriet felt a flash of irritation. "This isn't your decision alone, Xavier. This is my fight, my father's name to clear." Their eyes locked across the table, neither willing to back down. Finally, Hank cleared his throat. "Before you two go to war over this, let me suggest a compromise. My sister lives in Denver, runs a dress shop that caters to theater folk. If anyone can transform Harriet into someone unrecognizable, it's Catherine, and she knows people who might be able to help us get into that tournament legitimately." Xavier didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded reluctantly. "We'll ride for Denver today, then." "But Harriet," he added, his gaze softening slightly, "promise me you won't take unnecessary risks. Your father wouldn't want you to get hurt seeking justice for him." The mention of her father diffused some of Harriet's irritation. "I promise to be careful. But I will see this through, one way or another." Their journey to Denver took 3 days, during which Harriet learned more about Xavier's past as a Pinkerton detective, his extensive knowledge of the territory, and his surprising familiarity with literature, which he attributed to long nights on the trail with only books for company. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Promise Creek, her dreams of taking over the newspaper one day and turning it into a voice for truth throughout the territory, and her close relationship with her father since her mother's death from influenza when Harriet was just 12. By the time they reached Denver, a comfortable camaraderie had developed between them, punctuated by moments of something deeper: a held gaze, a lingering touch when he helped her mount or dismount, a shared laugh over a story told around the campfire. Catherine Williams proved to be exactly the ally they needed. A vibrant woman in her 40s with Hank's practical nature but a flair for the dramatic, she embraced their cause with enthusiasm after hearing their story. "So you need to make this young lady unrecognizable to people who have known her all her life, and you need entree into a high-stakes poker tournament," she circled Harriet appraisingly. "The first part is easy enough. The second, well, I have a friend who might help with that." Catherine's friend turned out to be Jeremiah Blackwood, a professional gambler with a reputation for honesty in a profession not known for it. He agreed to help after Catherine vouched for them, and Xavier explained the situation. I've heard rumors about Promise Creek being too dangerous for honest gamblers, Jeremiah admitted. If what you say is true, I'd be glad to help expose it. Besides, he added with a wink, there's nothing a gambler loves more than a long-shot bet with high stakes. Their plan took shape over the next 2 days. Jeremiah would enter the tournament legitimately, bringing Xavier as his personal security, a common practice among successful gamblers. Harriet, transformed by Catherine's considerable skills, would pose as Alina Montero, a wealthy widow from San Francisco with a penchant for gambling and an interest in investing in frontier towns. No one will connect Alina Montero with Harriet Mason, Catherine assured them as she fitted Harriet with a sophisticated gown in deep burgundy. Not with this black wig, the right cosmetics, and a completely different manner of speaking. Harriet practiced her new identity diligently, adopting a slight accent and mannerisms nothing like her usual straightforward style. Xavier watched these transformations with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're remarkably good at this," he commented during one practice session. "I'd never guess you were the same woman I met in the forest. Is that a compliment or a warning?" Harriet asked, momentarily dropping Alina's affected tones. Xavier's expression grew serious. "Both, perhaps. Just remember who you really are beneath the disguise." The night before they were to depart for Promise Creek, Harriet found Xavier alone on the balcony of Catherine's home, staring out at the lights of Denver. She joined him, standing close enough that their arms almost touched. "Having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "About the plan? No, about putting you in danger constantly. I can take care of myself, Xavier." "I know you can." He hesitated, then added, "That's part of what worries me." "You're brave enough to face anything, even when you should be afraid." Harriet smiled slightly. "Isn't that what you admired when we first met, my courage?" "Yes," he admitted. "But now I know you, Harriet Mason, really know you, and the thought of anything happening to you." He trailed off, looking away again, a warm feeling spread through Harriet's chest at his words. "Xavier," she said softly, placing her hand on his arm. "I feel the same way about you, but we have to do this, not just for my father, but for everyone affected by Wilkins' corruption." Xavier covered her hand with his own, his touch sending a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool evening air. "I know." He turned to face her fully. "Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "If things go wrong, if there's any sign of real danger, you'll get out. No heroics, no last stands for justice. You leave, and we regroup to fight another day." Harriet wanted to argue, but saw the genuine fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. "I promise," she said softly. They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then slowly Xavier raised his hand to her cheek, his touch feather-light. "Harriet," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. She leaned into his touch, her heart pounding. "Yes." Before he could continue, the balcony door opened, and Catherine's voice broke the moment. "There you two are. Jeremiah has some last-minute details to discuss before tomorrow." Xavier dropped his hand, stepping back slightly as reality intruded. "We'll be right there," he called, his eyes still on Harriet. With a shared look that acknowledged what had almost happened, they followed Catherine inside, both aware that whatever was growing between them would have to wait until their dangerous mission was complete. The journey back to Promise Creek was tense with anticipation. They traveled separately to avoid suspicion, Jeremiah and Xavier riding ahead, while Harriet followed a day later in a rented carriage befitting her wealthy widow persona, accompanied by Catherine, who would return to Denver once Harriet was safely established at the hotel. Promise Creek looked different to Harriet as she approached it disguised as Alina Montero. The familiar streets and buildings now seemed threatening rather than welcoming, and she felt a pang of loss for the home that had been taken from her. The Golden Nugget Saloon and Hotel had been transformed for the tournament. New paint gleamed on its facade, and elegantly dressed men and women moved in and out of its doors, visitors from neighboring towns and cities, drawn by the promise of high-stakes gambling and socializing. Catherine helped Harriet check into the hotel, fussing over her luggage and making a show of giving instructions to ensure Mrs. Montero was properly accommodated. It was a performance designed to establish Harriet's cover as a demanding woman of means. Once alone in her room, Harriet allowed herself a moment of doubt. The town she'd fled just 2 weeks ago now held her in its midst again, but as a stranger. It was disorienting and frightening, yet exhilarating too. A knock at her door startled her. Checking that her wig and makeup were perfectly in place, she opened it to find Xavier standing there, dressed in the fine clothes of a gentleman's security man rather than his usual cowboy attire. "Mrs. Montero," he said formally, loud enough for anyone in the hallway to hear. "Mr. Blackwood sends his compliments and invites you to join him for dinner this evening." Harriet adopted Alina's slight accent. "How kind of Mr. Blackwood. Please tell him I would be delighted." Xavier nodded, then lowered his voice once he was sure they weren't overheard. "Everything going according to plan?" "Yes," she whispered back. "No one has given me a second glance. We're settled in. Jeremiah has already made connections with several other players, including one who mentioned the mayor specifically invited him." Xavier's expression was grim. "There's something off about this whole tournament. The buy-in is unusually high, and security is lighter than it should be for the amount of money involved." "As if they're making it easy for a robbery," Harriet concluded. "Exactly. Be careful, Harriet. We'll talk more at dinner." Dinner was served in a private dining room at the hotel, with Jeremiah hosting several potential tournament participants, including Harriet as Alina. The conversation flowed freely, with discussions of business opportunities in the territory, the growing railway network, and of course, gambling. Mayor Wilkins made an appearance midway through the meal, personally welcoming the visitors to Promise Creek. Harriet's heart pounded as he approached their table, but she maintained Alina's composure, offering her hand and a cool smile. "Mrs. Alina Montero," she introduced herself. "From San Francisco." "A pleasure, Mrs. Montero," the mayor replied, kissing her hand with a flourish that made her skin crawl. "Promise Creek welcomes you. I trust you'll find our little tournament entertaining." "I certainly hope so," she replied. "I've come quite a long way for it." The mayor's gaze lingered on her a moment too long, but then he moved on, apparently satisfied that she was exactly who she claimed to be. Harriet released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. After dinner, Xavier escorted her back to her room, using the pretext of security to speak privately in the hallway. "The tournament begins tomorrow at noon," he murmured. "Jeremiah has heard rumors that something big is planned for the final night when the stakes will be highest." "That would be the logical time for a robbery," Harriet agreed. "What do we do until then? Observe, listen, try to find concrete evidence of the mayor's involvement with the Sutton gang." Xavier hesitated, then added, "and stay safe." The concern in his voice warmed her despite the tension of their situation. "You too, Xavier," he smiled slightly, reaching out to briefly touch her hand before departing. "Sleep well, Harriet." The next day passed in a blur of activity. The tournament began with 20 participants, including Jeremiah, playing at 4 different tables. Harriet, as Alina, observed from the sidelines, making a show of placing small side bets and socializing with the other spectators. She noticed Xavier positioned near Jeremiah, his vigilant gaze constantly scanning the room. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and a silent communication would pass between them, reassurance that all was well. By evening, the field had narrowed to 12 players. Jeremiah was among them, his stack of chips impressive but not suspiciously so. He played with skill but allowed others to win enough to avoid resentment. As Harriet mingled, she overheard snippets of conversation that confirmed their suspicions. Several visiting businessmen mentioned receiving personal invitations from the mayor, unusual for a tournament in such a small town. The prize pool was larger than seemed reasonable for Promise Creek's economy. And most tellingly, she noticed the sheriff speaking in hushed tones with a rough-looking man. She didn't recognize a man who slipped away through a back door shortly after their conversation. She managed to communicate this to Xavier during a brief moment when he escorted her to the bar for a refreshment. His expression darkened at the news. "That confirms it. They're planning something big. I'll have Jeremiah keep an eye out for any other suspicious activity during play tomorrow." The second day of the tournament followed a similar pattern, with the field narrowing further. Tension increased as the stakes grew higher. Harriet continued her observations, noting that several of the remaining players were carrying substantial amounts of cash. not just for the tournament but for side bets and other gambling that had sprung up around the main event. That evening, she was surprised to receive an invitation to dine with Mayor Wilkins at his home. It was delivered to her hotel room by a young boy who waited for her response. Harriet's instinct was to refuse, but she realized this might be an opportunity to gather more evidence. She penned a gracious acceptance, then immediately sought out Xavier to inform him of this development. "It's too dangerous," he said immediately when they met in a quiet corner of the hotel lobby. "He could recognize you." "My disguise has held up so far," she countered. "And this might be our only chance to find something concrete linking him to the Sutton gang." Xavier ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "At least let me accompany you as your security." Harriet shook her head. "The invitation was for me alone." "It would seem suspicious if I insisted on bringing you." She placed a hand on his arm. "I'll be careful, Xavier. If I sense any danger, I'll make an excuse and leave immediately." He covered her hand with his own, his expression troubled. "I don't like it, Harriet, I know. But we need evidence that will stand up in court, not just suspicions." After further discussion, Xavier reluctantly agreed but insisted on following her at a distance and keeping watch outside the mayor's house during the dinner. That evening, Harriet arrived at the mayor's residence dressed in her finest gown, a deep emerald silk that Catherine had selected to complete her transformation into Elena Montero. The mayor greeted her personally at the door, ushering her into a lavishly decorated parlor where several other guests were already enjoying pre-dinner drinks. "Mrs. Montero, allow me to introduce some of Promise Creek's most distinguished citizens," the mayor said, guiding her around the room. Harriet recognized several of the town council members who had supported the mayor in silencing her father. They showed no sign of recognizing her in return, accepting her as Elena without question. During dinner, the conversation revolved around business opportunities in Promise Creek and the surrounding area. The mayor was particularly interested in Elena's financial situation and investment plans. "San Francisco is becoming so crowded," Harriet explained in Elena's affected accent. "I'm considering establishing a presence elsewhere, somewhere with potential." "Promise Creek has tremendous potential," the mayor assured her. "With the right investments, we could become the most important town between Denver and Salt Lake City." After dinner, while the other guests were distracted with brandy and cigars, the mayor invited Harriet to see his private study. Warning bells rang in her mind, but this was exactly the opportunity she had been hoping for. The study was impressive, with leather-bound books lining the walls and a massive desk dominating the room. As the mayor poured them both a glass of fine whiskey, Harriet discreetly scanned the room for anything that might serve as evidence. "You know, Mrs. Montero," the mayor said, handing her a glass, "I pride myself on being a good judge of character, and there's something quite unusual about you." Harriet's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained Elena's composed demeanor. "Is that so? In what way?" The mayor studied her over the rim of his glass. "You're not like the other wealthy widows who occasionally pass through our town. You observe more, listen more." He stepped closer. "It makes me curious about your real interests here." "My interests are exactly as I've stated," Harriet replied coolly. "Business opportunities and a good poker game." The mayor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Still, I can't help but feel we've met before, though I know that's impossible." Before Harriet could respond, there was a knock at the study door. The mayor's expression shifted from suspicion to annoyance. "Yes," his housekeeper entered, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but there's a messenger with an urgent telegram." The mayor excused himself, leaving Harriet alone in the study. She acted quickly, moving to the desk and carefully checking drawers without disturbing their contents. In the bottom drawer, locked but easily picked with a hairpin, a skill her father had taught her for emergencies, she found what she was looking for: a ledger different from the town's official records, with entries corresponding to dates of known Sutton gang robberies and amounts that matched her father's notes. She removed a small pencil and paper from her purse and hastily copied several key entries, then replaced the ledger exactly as she had found it. She had just closed the drawer when she heard the mayor's footsteps returning. "My apologies for the interruption," he said as he re-entered the room. If he noticed anything amiss, he didn't show it. Not at all, Harriet replied, raising her glass in a small salute. Business never sleeps, does it? The mayor's smile was thin. Indeed it doesn't. The remainder of the evening passed without incident, though Harriet felt the mayor watching her more closely than before. When she finally took her leave, expressing gratitude for his hospitality, she was relieved to step outside into the cool night air. True to his word, Xavier was waiting in the shadows across the street. He fell into step beside her as she walked back toward the hotel. "Did you find anything?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered, excitement in her voice despite her exhaustion. "A second ledger with entries that match the Sutton gang robberies. I copied down dates and amounts." Xavier's face broke into a grin. "That's exactly what we needed. Well done, Harriet." Their hands brushed as they walked, and for a moment Harriet thought he might take hers in his. But they were still in public, still playing roles, so the moment passed. Back at the hotel, they shared her findings with Jeremiah in his room, careful to speak in low voices. "This is compelling," Jeremiah agreed after examining her notes, "but still circumstantial. We need to catch them in the act to make it stick." "The final day of the tournament is tomorrow," Xavier reminded them. "If they're going to make their move, that's when it will happen." They refined their plan late into the night. Jeremiah would continue in the tournament, which was down to the final 6 players. Xavier would maintain his position as security, watching for any sign of the Sutton gang. Harriet would circulate as Alina, alert for unusual activity or conversations. Most importantly, they had sent word to a federal marshal Jeremiah knew and trusted, asking him to position himself and several deputies near Promise Creek, ready to act when they sent a signal. As Harriet prepared for bed that night, a soft knock came at her door. Checking through the peephole, she saw Xavier standing in the hallway, his expression troubled. She opened the door just enough to speak to him. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "May I come in?" "Just for a moment," he added, clearly aware of the impropriety. Harriet hesitated, then nodded, opening the door wider to admit him. He entered but remained standing near the door, respecting her privacy. "I wanted to tell you," he began, then paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Tomorrow will be dangerous, Harriet, if anything happens." "If we're discovered, we won't be," she assured him. "The plan is solid. Plans can go wrong." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Before they do, I need you to know something." Harriet's heart began to race at the intensity in his eyes. "What is it?" "These past 2 weeks working with you, getting to know you." He took a deep breath. "I've never met anyone like you, Harriet Mason. Your courage, your intelligence, your unwavering commitment to the truth. It's remarkable." She felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Xavier." "Let me finish," he said gently. "If tomorrow goes as planned, we'll have achieved what we set out to do. Justice for your father, exposure of Wilkins' corruption, and then..." "And then," she prompted when he hesitated. "And then you'll be free to return to your life, to rebuild the newspaper, to become the voice of truth you were meant to be." His gaze held her steadily. "I just want you to know that, whatever you decide to do after this is over, I would like to remain a part of your life, if you'll have me." The sincerity in his voice touched Harriet deeply. Without thinking, she closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his chest. "I can't imagine not having you in my life now, Xavier. These past 2 weeks have changed everything for me." His hand came up to cover hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "For me too." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, Xavier leaned down as Harriet tilted her face up to his. Their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened as 2 weeks of building attraction finally found expression. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he murmured, though he made no move to leave. "You should," Harriet agreed, equally reluctant to end the moment. With visible effort, Xavier stepped back. "Tomorrow," he said, "after it's all over." Harriet nodded, understanding all he wasn't saying. "Tomorrow," she confirmed. With one last lingering look, Xavier departed, leaving Harriet to touch her fingers to her lips in wonder, her mind spinning with the events of the day and the promise of what might come after their dangerous mission was complete. The final day of the tournament dawned bright and clear. By noon, the Golden Nugget was packed with spectators eager to watch the championship table where the last 6 players, including Jeremiah, would compete for the substantial prize pool. Harriet circulated through the crowd as Alina, exchanging pleasantries and placing occasional side bets to maintain her cover. She noticed the mayor was present, looking confident and occasionally checking his pocket watch. The sheriff was also there, positioned near the main entrance, his gaze constantly moving over the crowd. Xavier maintained his position near Jeremiah but caught Harriet's eye occasionally, their shared glance communicating more than words could in the crowded room. As the afternoon wore on, the tension in the room increased. 2 players were eliminated, leaving 4, then 3. Jeremiah was still in the game, his expression revealing nothing as he methodically played his cards. It was during a brief break in play when Harriet noticed a new group of men enter the saloon. 5 of them, dressed like ordinary cowboys but with a hardness to their eyes that set them apart. They dispersed through the crowd, positioning themselves strategically around the room. Harriet made her way casually toward Xavier, pretending to order a drink at the bar near him. 5 men just entered, she murmured without looking at him directly. I think it's them. Xavier nodded almost imperceptibly. I saw them. The one by the back door is Luke Sutton himself. I recognized him from wanted posters. He shifted slightly. The marshal should be in position by now. I sent the signal an hour ago when I stepped out for fresh air. What's our move? Harriet asked, accepting her drink from the bartender with a smile. Wait, let them make the first move. We need to catch them in the act. The tournament resumed, now down to the final 3 players, Jeremiah and 2 others. The pot had grown enormous, with stacks of cash and gold on the table that would tempt any outlaw. Mayor Wilkins stepped up to the table, raising his hands for attention. Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach the exciting conclusion of our tournament, I'd like to propose a brief celebration. Drinks for everyone, courtesy of the town of Promise Creek. This announcement was met with cheers. As the crowd's attention focused on the free drinks being distributed, Harriet noticed the mayor make a subtle hand gesture toward one of the men she'd identified as part of the Sutton gang. It's happening, she whispered to Xavier, who had moved closer under the pretense of ensuring his employer's security. Before Xavier could respond, the main doors of the saloon burst open and a voice bellowed, "Nobody move. This is a robbery." Luke Sutton and his men drew their weapons simultaneously, covering the crowd as panic erupted. People screamed and ducked for cover as the outlaws moved toward the tournament table where the money was piled. "Everyone stay calm and no one gets hurt," Sutton called out. "We're just here for the money, not your lives." Xavier had pushed Harriet behind him protectively, his hand on his concealed weapon. "Stay down," he muttered. "The marshal should be here any minute." Harriet watched in horror and fascination as the robbery unfolded. What struck her most was not the outlaw's efficiency, but the lack of genuine surprise on Mayor Wilkins' face. He was putting on a show of shock and outrage, but his eyes told a different story. The sheriff, too, was suspiciously ineffective, fumbling with his weapon and positioning himself where he could do the least good. As the Sutton gang began stuffing the tournament money into bags, Harriet noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the gang members was looking directly at Mayor Wilkins, who gave a small nod and then glanced meaningfully toward the bar where Xavier and Harriet were crouched. "Xavier," she whispered urgently. "The mayor recognized me. He knows." Xavier's expression hardened. "We need to move. Now." But it was too late. 2 of the gang members were already heading in their direction, guns drawn. "You there?" one called. "Stand up slowly." Xavier moved first, drawing his weapon with lightning speed and firing a warning shot over their heads. "Everyone down." He shouted to the crowd as chaos erupted anew. The saloon dissolved into pandemonium as patrons scrambled for the exits. In the confusion, Harriet saw Luke Sutton grab the money bags and head for the back door, the mayor close behind him not as a hostage, but as a partner. "The mayor's escaping with Sutton," she called to Xavier, who was exchanging gunfire with the 2 gang members who had approached them. "Go," Xavier shouted back. "I'll hold them off. The marshal should be here any second." Harriet hesitated only a moment before darting through the crowd toward the back door. She couldn't let the mayor escape, not when they were so close to exposing him. She burst into the alley behind the saloon just in time to see Mayor Wilkins and Luke Sutton loading the money bags into a waiting wagon. Without thinking, she called out, "Stop right there, Mayor Wilkins." Both men whirled around, guns drawn. The mayor's eyes widened in recognition as he looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. "Mason's daughter," he spat. "I should have known that voice. I'd recognize it anywhere." "It's over," Harriet declared, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The federal marshal is on his way, and we have evidence of your corruption." Sutton looked at the mayor in alarm. "You said this would be clean, no complications." "Shut up," the mayor hissed before turning back to Harriet. "Evidence. Your father had evidence too, and look where that got him." A cold realization washed over Harriet. "You killed him. It wasn't an accident." The mayor's smile was cruel. He was too stubborn for his own good, just like his daughter. Sutton, growing increasingly agitated, raised his gun toward Harriet. "We don't have time for this." "She's seen us, she knows too much." Harriet backed up a step, suddenly aware of the very real danger she was in. The mayor nodded grimly. "Do it, make it quick." As Sutton took aim, several things happened at once. The sound of gunfire erupted from inside the saloon, growing louder. Shouts of U.S. Marshal could be heard, and most surprisingly, Xavier appeared at the entrance to the alley, his gun trained on Sutton. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice deadly calm, "or the next bullet goes through your head." Sutton hesitated, his gun still pointed at Harriet. The mayor, seeing his opportunity slipping away, made a desperate move. He lunged for the wagon, clearly intending to flee with the money while Sutton provided cover. Xavier fired a warning shot that splintered the wood near the mayor's hand, freezing him in place. "I said drop it," he repeated to Sutton. "Now." The standoff lasted only seconds before the alley was suddenly filled with armed men. The federal marshal and his deputies had arrived. With overwhelming force against them, both Sutton and the mayor surrendered. As the marshal's men took the outlaws and the mayor into custody, Xavier rushed to Harriet's side, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt? I told you to stay down." Despite the tension of the moment, Harriet couldn't help but smile. "And I told you I would see this through to the end." Xavier shook his head, a mixture of exasperation and admiration in his expression. "You are the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Harriet Mason." "Thank you," she replied, her smile widening. "I consider that a compliment." The marshal approached them, holstering his weapon. "Mr. Stone, Miss Mason," he greeted them. "Looks like your information was spot on. We've got the whole Sutton gang in custody, along with your corrupt mayor." "What about the evidence?" Harriet asked anxiously. "We have copies of ledgers showing the mayor's involvement, but we found the original ledgers in the mayor's office," the marshal assured her. "And several members of the gang are already talking, hoping for leniency. The case against Wilkins is solid." Relief washed over Harriet. After weeks of danger and uncertainty, it was finally over. Justice for her father was within reach. As the marshal left to oversee the prisoner's transport, Xavier turned to Harriet, his expression softening. "It's done," he said quietly. "Your father would be proud." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes at his words. "Yes," she agreed, "I think he would be." Xavier reached out to brush a tear from her cheek, his touch gentle. "What now, Harriet Mason? Back to your newspaper. Promise Creek needs a voice of truth now more than ever." Harriet leaned into his touch, considering the future that had seemed so uncertain just days before. "Yes," she said finally. "The Promise Creek Gazette will publish again. The people deserve to know everything that happened. And after that." Xavier asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice that she'd never heard before. Harriet met his gaze steadily. "After that depends on you, Xavier Stone. You mentioned wanting to remain part of my life. Did you mean it?" His smile was slow and full of promise as he drew her closer. "Every word." "In fact, I was thinking Promise Creek might be a good place to settle down. A former Pinkerton detective could set up as a private investigator, perhaps, work alongside a crusading newspaper editor." "I think that sounds like a perfect partnership," Harriet replied, her heart lighter than it had been in months. Xavier's arms encircled her waist. "I was hoping you'd say that," he murmured before capturing her lips in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. In the days that followed, Promise Creek underwent a transformation. With Mayor Wilkins and his corrupt officials removed from power, the town held emergency elections. Honest citizens who had been silenced or marginalized under the old regime stepped forward to serve. Harriet reopened the Promise Creek Gazette, publishing a detailed account of the mayor's corruption and her father's vindication. The first issue sold out completely, with people from neighboring towns coming to purchase copies. Xavier, true to his word, established an investigation service in an office adjacent to the newspaper. His Pinkerton experience and connections proved valuable not only to his new business, but to Harriet's journalism as well. 3 months after the dramatic events at the Golden Nugget, Harriet stood in the small cemetery on the outskirts of town, placing fresh flowers on her father's grave. Xavier stood beside her, his hand warm and supportive on her shoulder. "He would be so proud of what you've accomplished," Xavier said softly. Harriet nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "I wish he could have seen it, the newspaper thriving, the town healing. He sees it through you," Xavier assured her, "through every word you print, every truth you tell." As they walked back toward town, arm in arm, Harriet reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. From being chased from town for speaking her mind to returning in triumph, from losing her father to finding a partner who valued her voice above all else. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Harriet smiled up at him. "I was thinking about the first night we met when you said you'd been waiting to hear my voice. Did you really mean that?" Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I meant every word. In a world where most people stay silent in the face of injustice, your voice rang out clear and true." He took both her hands in his. "And I've been falling in love with that voice and the remarkable woman behind it every day since." Harriet's heart swelled at his words. "I love you too, Xavier Stone, for believing in me when no one else did, for standing beside me when it would have been easier to walk away." "I wouldn't have missed it for the world," he replied, drawing her close for a kiss that felt like a promise. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning, the citizens of Promise Creek gathered in the newly restored town square to witness the wedding of Harriet Mason and Xavier Stone. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, with Jeremiah Blackwood serving as best man and Catherine Williams attending as matron of honor. As they exchanged vows, Harriet thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance meeting in the forest to partners in both work and life. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from the assembled townspeople seemed to echo the joy in her own heart. The Promise Creek Gazette and Stone Investigations flourished side by side, becoming institutions in a town renewed by honest governance and transparent dealings. Harriet's fearless reporting earned her recognition throughout the territory, while Xavier's investigative skills brought justice to those who might otherwise have been overlooked. A year after their wedding, their family grew with the birth of their son, Jonathan, named for Harriet's father. As Harriet held her newborn son, with Xavier seated beside her on their bed, she marveled at how completely her life had changed since that fateful day when she'd stood up against corruption and been chased from town. "What are you thinking?" Xavier asked, echoing his frequent question as he gazed adoringly at his wife and son. "I'm thinking that speaking my mind turned out to be the best decision I ever made," Harriet replied, leaning against him contentedly. "Even if it did get me chased out of town." Xavier chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Thank goodness it did, otherwise I might never have heard that voice I'd been waiting for all my life." As the sun set over Promise Creek, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Harriet Mason Stone knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the love of a man who had valued her voice from the very beginning, who had helped her find justice, and who would stand beside her through whatever challenges lay ahead. And in the years that followed, as their family grew with the addition of a daughter 2 years later, as the newspaper expanded to cover the entire county, as Xavier's reputation for integrity and results brought clients from across the territory, Harriet never forgot the lesson she had learned that summer day in 1876. That a single voice, raised in the cause of truth, could change everything. Every evening, after the newspaper was put to bed and the children were tucked in for the night, Harriet and Xavier would sit together on the porch of their home overlooking Promise Creek, discussing the day's events, planning for tomorrow's challenges, and marveling at the life they had built together, a life that had begun with courage, been tested by danger, and was sustained by a love as vast and enduring as the western sky above them.